Good morning, everyone. As Dave said, I'm John Olsen. I'm the New York State lead, and I'm delighted to bring Clyde Vanel, a friend and a champion of the blockchain industry, before you today to discuss, what's happening in New York, what has happened over the last 8 to 10 months, and where we may be going in 23 and beyond. So with that, I kind of want to take us back to when I first joined the Blockchain Association, and coming on board, looking at the landscape of, the advocacy in New York, in Albany, with respect to the blockchain industry and to the cryptocurrency industry. So I kind of want to get Clyde's perspective a little bit on how he viewed the engagement from industry and what mobilization looked like for him as an elected official and as someone who was very concerned with some of the legislation that was being advanced in his House and in the Senate as well.
First of all, good morning, everybody. I want to, and Kristen and Dave did the intro for this policy summit, but I want to give a major shout out to the Blockchain Association for even having this summit and putting everyone together in light of what's happening in the industry and what's happening in around because they feel a lot of stuff in the air. But I just want to, first of all, give Blockchain Association a round of applause for putting this together. Thank you guys for doing this. Now, keep in mind, it's very important for industry to engage with policymakers. So what you're doing about this policy summit is a really important thing because the way forward to make sure that this industry, to make sure that we protect consumers, to make sure that investors are protected, to make sure that communities properly use these different technologies and use these financial assets is something that we have to get right together. So that's really important. Now, get back to your question.
My question is, there didn't seem to be a lot of presence in Albany when I first came on board last March. It seemed that it was kind of a bit of a ragtag crew of lobbyists. So given that there was some significant legislation like a proposed mining moratorium, how did you view this year's engagement versus maybe the prior year when you were kind of sounding the alarm to folks, but there really wasn't kind of any, concerted effort to push back?
So one thing that's important to understand is how to properly frame how policymakers in New York State, and you'll hear from federal government, but I'm talking about New York State, how policymakers address the technology sector, because I'm going to put blockchain in the technology sector. Mm-hmm. Now keep in mind, we're very good, and there are entrenched institutional lobbyists and groups that work in the other spaces like, education, like labor, like, name them, mm-hmm. energy or what have you. But when it came to technology, when I first got elected in 2016, we didn't even have a technology committee. We didn't even have a technology subcommittee. So, the focus on technology was, it was that over there. Mm-hmm. Another thing too that's been there's still a sentiment of tech backlash, right? So, figuring all that out is really important to figure out how, and another aspect is, I find that the industry, again, is a relatively new industry compared to other industries. So I believe it looked like it's the technology industry on a certain level is still at its adolescence stages to figure out how to deal with us. So given all that, and then on top of that, the technology, the culture of blockchain technology, the decentralization, the we don't need government aspect, the blah blah blah, also further complicates mm-hmm. the relationship between the policymakers and the industry.
Right. So for a nascent industry that's kind of just finding its footing, both in engagement at the federal level, but now kind of taking a look at the states and the possibility of adverse legislation moving in a state well before anything happens at the congressional level. How do we move forward, given that we may be facing a mining moratorium in New York? It would be the only state that has such a moratorium. the negative signal it sends to the cryptocurrency industry that really wants to be in New York and makes sense to it be in New York with, the financial markets. How do we move forward, given that, we can possibly expect the governor to sign this bill? It would be fantastic if she vetoed it, but there's other legislation out there, and there's obviously a new legislative session coming up. So where do we go as an industry, working with you, working with your colleagues, to kind of change the narrative a little bit around blockchain?
Here's how important the situation is and what we're dealing with. And here's what I think where the industry should go. Now, keep in mind, I believe, as far as, and with respect to how you guys deal with policymakers, what are you up against? You're up against seasoned, mature industries and opposition that have relationships with policymakers, that organize well, that mobilize well, their interests. I think that this industry needs to do that better. We saw you guys behind your leadership of this organization and other organizations. We saw better engagement, but with the policymakers. Another thing that's important too is we still have an education gap. We still have a knowledge gap. You still have to be able to educate the policymakers on what this stuff means. What is it? What's the possibilities of this industry? What does it actually do? And then how you frame it is really important, John. Right? When you come to policymakers, generally speaking, or government, and you lead with technology, you lose us. Right? I think that when you come and tell us what have you, right? For example, what do I mean? I don't need to know how bits and packets flow through the air to understand that the internet is important.
Sure.
Right? I don't need to know how the cell phone works, right? But to understand that that we need broadband service. How does this stuff affect people, right? How does this stuff affect what are the stories behind this industry? Mm-hmm. When we talk about mining, for example, I think that if we don't properly have the proper mining policy in New York State, that could have negative effects on the entire industry. Mm-hmm. There are people that I've spoken to in the industry that says, we don't mind, that's not a business, that's not us. And I think that's a problem. Part of the problem is that, again, I know I'm in D.C., but New York is the Empire State. New York is more important than everywhere in the world. But I say that in jest, but honestly, states watch each other, right? And
right.
The federal government watch the states or what have you. If we have bad policy, we could actually start a ripple effect of having bad policy across the country. So we have to look at every industry, every household. We have to look at what is our carbon footprint? How could we be more efficient? How could we do what we do better? And that doesn't exclude mining, right? But we need to work together to figure that out, right? We shouldn't stop and say, what are we looking at? And then figure things out. I mean, we don't ask any industry to stop in the middle of its tracks or what have you. Another thing that's dangerous is that we shouldn't choose validation processes, right? Mm-hmm. What we should be doing is working to see how do we make this better. John, when I first got elected, I traveled to see some of these big mining companies in upstate New York. I don't know if people know the geography of New York, but most of these facilities are in our rural areas, mm-hmm. And New York City's downstate in the upstate. So I went and traveled and saw some of them. And 5 years ago, huge mining facilities, many rigs, few people working.
Sure.
I went again this year, 5 years later, huge mining facilities, more, and hundreds of people working.
An industry,
different. Talking about people, I saw folks without advanced computer science degrees doing advanced network engineering. I saw people that looked like, no, I don't want to talk bad about folks, but looked like, regular everyday folks, right? That were actually working with microscopic tools fixing motherboards from local rural areas. I saw people that had jobs that were 3 times the average salary of the local area. Now, I don't know about you, but I think one of the hardest things to do as a policymaker is to be able to bring good jobs to an area.
Absolutely in New York.
And in rural New York. That's a big deal. That's
upstate for sure.
That's a big deal. That doesn't mean we don't work together to try to figure out how to properly have this industry use energy better.
So, and to that point, you were instrumental in getting a bill across the finish line this year, and thank you for your leadership on this, but the Blockchain and Cryptocurrency Task Force is also under consideration by the governor, and that would appoint panelists of experts to really look at the impact of the industry to the state as a whole, not just the environmental or energy impacts, but the financial impacts, the ability to create access to wealth and to create new avenues to the underbanked. I think it's critical at this point, especially given what's happening in other states, Governor Newsom's executive order kind of mirroring the Biden administration's executive order, that New York really step up and start showing the industry that it cares that it's there, for one, and that it wants to be a good steward and a responsible regulator. So I think it's essential that the governor sign this task force, but where we go from there is really about, who's on it and how much, how many teeth does it really have when it starts to look at some of the impacts, not just from the energy side, but also the financial side.
Here's what's really important, and I don't want to gloss over this. This industry has to play offense more and not less defense, right? So we spend so much time talking about the bill that we just spoke about, right? But here's some offense, right? So the blockchain cryptocurrency bill task force that creates a task force of stakeholders that include policymakers, that includes industry, that includes the environmentalists, that includes regulators, right? That includes community folks, that includes that has to figure out
academics. Yeah.
That includes academics, that helps figure out what's our way forward with this industry. How do we close the digital divide? How do we get the unbanked and underbanked banked? How do we make sure we protect investors? How do we use this technology properly? How does the state, what's our relationship with this kind of stuff? That way, again, we can help figure these things out. And in a space, in an industry where things are changing so rapidly, we have to be able to be nimble, at the same time be able to figure out how to properly protect and to be able to use it as a shield and a sword in this space. That's why this is so important. And it's really important that even in this, when we talk about using, media in this industry or what have you, very important to highlight the offense, the bills that are trying to be responsible, the folks that are trying to be responsible in this space. It's difficult times. A lot is changing. A lot is shifting. There's a lot of sifting sand. But how do we make sure that the majority of the industry that I've seen, the majority of the people are good actors? What just happened is bad, but what's good is we have to sift the bad actors out too. That's a good thing also.
Absolutely.
How do we figure this out, and how do we navigate this together? And I think that's really important.
And how do we bring the industry home? I mean, it belongs here in the States. It belongs in New York, right? How do we turn New York into a crypto capital? Well, it starts with responsible regulation, but it also starts with a good offense. And I know you and I will be leading the charge next year, so I really do thank you for your leadership on this. You've been a great champion of blockchain and the internet in general, and I look forward to working with you for the years to come.
But before anybody says anything, what's really important is yesterday, the folks that are lobbying other bills or what have you, and this, the governor has until the end of the year to sign my bill or the other bill or both or what have you. So we're in crunch time.
That's right.
And I want to see what you guys do. It's time to step up.
Sounds good.
All right.